Hi everyone, I'm Siddharth Ramakrishnan, and this podcast is about neural magic, the idea of how we have the power to create intentions, manifest, lay out spells, and create rituals, and how we are wired for it. Today I'm very excited because I have a special guest here, Thomas Witholt from Hermit's Mirror, who I met at a tarot conference. Almost every year for the last couple of years, and who has created his own deck of cards and does a lot of tarot readings and classes. And I thought that it might be a good way to kind of dissect his brain apart a little bit to try and figure out how his magical ideas and intentions come from. And so it's more of a freewheeling conversation. And I'm hoping that through this, we will learn more about each other. So that's kind of where it is. Welcome,
Great.
Thomas.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Siddharth. It's good to be able to chat. It's always fun, at the conferences when we can chat. So this is a nice, yeah.
So I guess a basic question is: do you believe in magic? It's a big question, but it's a question. Yeah, do you believe in magic?
Yeah, I do. I think how we each define it, I think varies and carries a lot of weight in that definition. But I do believe in being able to sort of shift the trajectory of where things are headed with energetics that we can't fully explain and
Mm-mm-mm.
don't necessarily fully understand how they work, but we can practice, adjust, try and figure out our own kind of scientific method behind, okay, what is actually shifting change? Is it a psychological effect that helps me focus, keeps me attentive to opportunities, aware of potential pitfalls, sort of like deep reflection? Is it something else that's happening underneath the surface beyond what we can see with normal senses? How much do we get to like play with other people's stuff? But yes, I do.
And have you, from a very young age, have you believed in this, or is this something you've kind of grown into? How can you remember, like when you first started thinking about it?
Yeah, so if you define any kind of like psychic gift sort of thing as magic, then yes, from a very young age. My mother read coffee grounds when I was a kid. My sister had psychic insights. My mother had psychic dreams that would foretell events that very quickly happened. So, yes, on that front, as far as more witchy sorts of things, which is more where my practice aligns. Like there was a long period as a child of, the fantasy version of magic. Very big into fantasy role playing games and video games and books and all of that stuff. And then in my teens, I lived in a very liberal Massachusetts town, and so witchcraft was a thing. Like
Oh.
it wasn't that weird to see people reading or talking about it. Definitely not the majority, but I think I knew more witches than Catholics. And so that was in my milieu. And so I just started reading about witchcraft and practicing different spells, different ways of reading tarot, all of that stuff at a pretty young age in the 90s when it was, the height of popular culture, satanic panic, all of that stuff.
It's interesting because my foray into, so I used to have kind of psychic dreams, but around 6 or 7, and then but a lot of it was surrounding death and people dying. So my grandmother shut it down. She kind of gave me like these kind of chants and mantras to kind of say, okay, you need to like stop this or you're going to get into trouble. So she kind of shut it down. But all our witchy stuff was almost through religious rituals, Indian, like Hindu rituals, a lot of like invoke like fire and water and stuff. So a lot of like natural elements are weaved into the rituals. So our rituals were not like out of the organized religion. It's like kind of
Hmm.
part and parcel of the organized religion. Even though my parents worshipped at an altar, like, and then but they sent us to a school where altar worship was kind of saying no, you can't have like a physical representation of God. It has to be like elemental almost. So almost like they threw us into a pagan school almost in terms of that. So it's kind of interesting for me to hear from people who kind of talk about it in a non-organized religion kind of way. But that's interesting that almost you were encouraged to kind of follow that path of witchiness or.
Yeah, I don't know if I was encouraged. I grew up Christian. I went to church every Sunday, but my parents were divorced, and so that was very much the father's path. And I participated willingly up until a certain point. And then on the my mother's side, like her friends would talk about angels, like they had a parking angel. They would pray to saints or light candles, not coming from a Catholic background at all. And so uh yeah, it was more that they sort of existed alongside, and it was, the witchcraft that I got into was primarily through like green magic, right? So
Mm,
working with plants and paying attention to nature spirits and that sort of thing. And that is still where I feel a lot of calling.
mm,
And I think you can mask and sort of second guess, you can be a healthy skeptic when you're
mm,
talking about things like herbalism and traditional Chinese medicine and stuff like that, where there are different lineages converging when you are looking at herbs and plants and stuff like that. That's certainly not like where it stops for me, but that is where I first like fell in love with it, was the nature
mm,
aspect.
mm, mm. That's really beautiful. It feels like a lot of the nature stuff has been taken out by colonialism on some level, like and like the whole "this is the way you need to be" and kind of ways of knowing. It's in right now, as a biologist who's teaching like introduction to biology, I am reintroducing the concept of ways of knowing into my classes and say, the scientific method is one way of knowing the world, and there are other intuitive ways of kind of thinking about plants and how they are used and how they affect your body that cultures have kind of talked about for centuries. So that's really nice that you kind of are talking about that on some level. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So I know that we've talked about being queer before, and magic is a way for me has almost been a way for me to think about, I don't belong in certain worlds, and kind of helps me kind of think about belonging in a fantasy world of sorts. So I'm kind of trying to figure out how do you reconcile your queerness with immersion in magic.
Yes, I am a big fan of this question and this topic because so I was an anthropology major in my undergrad, and for my senior honors thesis, I was curious about the interplay of non-heterosexuality and Wicca because it's such a heterosexually coded masculine, feminine, right?
Mm, mm,
Atame, cup kind of symbolism, and there's certainly a branch of it that is deeply rooted in god and goddess having sex as masculine and feminine. And so I was curious because I also felt as though there was a pretty wide array of sexualities of people that I knew who were interested in the occult, broadly speaking, not necessarily Wicca, not necessarily just witchcraft, but sort of like witchy, hashtag witchy vibes, right? And they were some way of being queer, whether that was homosexual or more open, kink, whatever. And yeah, one of the sort of things that I hypothesized and think is an important part of it is that spirituality in America is has been predominantly evangelical Christian for much of the 20th century, and
mm,
certainly the 21st century, at least in my experience of it, my understanding of it. And witchcraft, woo, witchy things are so anti that in their origins, I think. And yes, they're Christian mystics who practice magic. I was considered myself Christian while getting into witchcraft. So I fully understand those contradictions, but that there was this idea of being anti traditionalist, right?
mm,
Like not going with conformity, norm culture. And so I think in the way that queerness was always a little bit punk,
mm, mm, mm.
prior to maybe Obergefell,
Yeah.
right? Before Will and Grace, I think witchcraft also was. And certainly we see the like right wing leaning, crystal girlies and herbalists and all of that as they've always been there. They're much more visible now. But I do think that in the 90s, at least, when I was first getting into this, there was this real sort of like counterculture understanding of magic and queerness that, it allowed you to say, oh, I don't operate like this, 90%. Um, on this front, why am I not just questioning everything and being open to all of these other, as you said, ways of knowing, just because this has been sort of the standard doctrine that doesn't, once I question one thing, it's easier to question another.
Yeah. That I mean, so is your thesis like, it's is that something that you're continuing to investigate like after you
Oh, no,
finish your undergrad, or
it did not go well.
I'm really
So, in
fascinated.
anthropology, one of the sort of key precepts, I think until like about when I was in school, was participant observation, like
Mm.
emphasis on like not causing a disruption, seamlessly integrating, not really critiquing or challenging. And there was so much bullshit in that group that I just quickly lost all of that objectivity. And so I wasn't able to finish that thesis and I just removed myself from the group. It's like, these people are too much. That was one particular group. It was my college, like I think it was Wiccan and Pagan Society, was sort of how they define themselves as like a student group. And that was my like little ethnography was with them. And I just totally ruined my own work by some of the things that I had to say.
Do you feel the flip side is something like the opposite of how has magic or the practice of it helped you as a queer person?
Hmm. I mean, I think one of the tenets of magic, particularly a certain lineage of witchcraft, is anti oppressor, right? So if you're
Mm-hmm.
part of any marginalized group, the idea is that magic helps you to level the playing field or seek retribution on
Mm-mm-mm.
your oppressor, sort of correct. Do the work of karma early. And so I think in that way it can help empower those who feel disempowered if it's used in that way. It can certainly also reinforce existing power structures if it's co-opted by those groups. But certainly the way that I and a lot of other people who I know practice, it is meant to be balance restoring in a kind of way.
Mm-mm-mm. Yeah, for me also, I feel like that openness to embodying like different energies, the male or the female, or nature energies, where it's kind of really liberating in some on some level. And I guess maybe when I was growing up, where I was kind of still coming to terms with my sexuality, it allowed me to kind of embrace it because there was this other outlet. So I really value this dimension that's there, that's allowed me to kind of be whole on some level. So I really appreciate that aspect of magic, or the magical thinking that's there.
Yeah, I'm curious for you, how did that evolve out of a spiritual practice or religious practice that was already, to many Western eyes, uh, pseudo magical or had some elements of the mystic, of sort of fate changing, of
Yeah,
invoking elements?
Indian mythology is filled with goddesses and powerful female deities, and also a lot of stories and myths around sex changes and gender fluidity. It's all like weaved into pretty much every single myth that we have. But the society itself is super heteronormative and super, like, even if you go to parties, like the guys go and hang in one place and the girls go and hang in other places. And so there's a big disconnect between how you pray or how you deal with religion and rituals, as opposed to how you actually act it out. So on some level it was a little bit hidden, the whole who do you relate to, which deity do you relate to more, and things like that is a little hidden on some level. But at the same time, you literally have examples of androgynous figures who are revered by everybody. So it is interesting. And when I came out, I was telling my parents or my dad about all these historical or mythological figures. And my dad had to kind of quote the Bible at me in order for him to have any counter arguments to things I was spouting. So it's really interesting how the kind of helps, but at the same time it doesn't mesh with current society and societal norms. And it still exists to this day, like where even after being gay became legal in India, it's still people are still finding that oppression still going on. And it's not just queer people, it's also women, like, but they revere all these powerful female deities, but then the way women are treated in a lot of Indian society is not on par or not as equal. So yeah, yeah. So I want to kind of talk about intentions and how do you set intentions, and like, some is it a practice that you have, or is it something you think about? Do you have like a flash of a vision in your head? Like, how do you set your intentions?
Yeah, you're talking specifically about like a project or when doing
Let's
magical
say
workings
that
or
you want to manifest something and you want to set an intention for it. How do you go about doing that?
hmm. Um, so I have the ideas that I have for things tend to come in two different directions. There's the intuitive, like, oh, this is a thing that is being called into being somehow, right? Like, it's the right time, it makes sense, things seem to converge. I'm just going to run with this, see how far I get. In those instances, there's very little intention that happens because it feels like a reception. And
Mm,
then as there's energy for it, both from me, from the universe, then I work on it. And usually those things happen pretty quickly as a result because like things have just aligned to make them
mm.
possible or
I want to
they
break
they
that a
never
little
happen.
bit. I want to break that a little bit. So when you say you intuitively feel it, where do you feel it? Is it like a is it do you feel it in your body? Do you feel like a lightness? Do you feel like, what do you mean you feel the intuitive
Yeah, so
perception?
it's almost like a stray thought, but it feels different. And partly because I don't have that many stray thoughts. I think I've done a pretty good job of mindfulness in corralling my brain so that when it's time to focus on things, I focus on things, and when it's time to just not be thinking much, I can just be processing in the background, and it's not necessarily like a stray thought. Obviously, I still have stray thoughts, but you can usually tell, right? Like it's like, oh, I was thinking about this thing, and now I'm obsessing, or I just heard a thing that triggered this thought. These are more, they seem to come out of nowhere and not be, not that I can't rationalize them. I did textual studies as a graduate. And so, like, I can see the text on everything and make a case for why I may have had that thought. But from a, it would be a pretty subtle influence in those instances of something in the immediate surroundings. And so it tends to be something that has either been percolating for a while, has now bubbled up, and there's something that then triggers that, and it feels as if it is a thought from someone else that has been given to me to sort of sit with.
Mm,
And I am a believer in the idea of these sort of like collective unconscious thoughts that find an outlet to those who are willing to do the work, and it's not really for you, like
mm,
particular. Like
mm,
if you are the recipient of that, it's because you are paying attention. It's not because you're some sort of golden child who needs to do this thing. And if you don't do it, someone else will,
mm,
right? Like the muse finds their outlet.
mm, mm,
And so for me, it typically feels like it's from someone else. And sometimes the energy isn't there. I sort of mull it over, I think through it, I plan for it, and the rest of life doesn't allow it to happen easily. And so that idea moves on and someone else does it.
mm,
And so I can, I've over the years been able to identify some of these things for myself as like, oh, okay, this is something to run with and go with. Oh, this is something that someone else did the following year, right? And you didn't do it, and yes, we can come up with rational reasons for why you both wanted to do that thing. There are no new ideas anymore, right? But, it just feels different in the thinking of it, right? Where it will just, there's not a lot of stuff attached to it. There's not like it's not part of a to-do list. It's not
Mm.
coming off of it's not like the other half of where I would say I get ideas, which is thought experiments, where I say like, what if conceptually I took this and I merged them together. And so that's sort of the other half of things. And so I'm able to distinguish for myself how those are quite different experiences, one that is more delivered and the other one that is built up.
I love that. It's almost like you're a vessel. I almost also was thinking like as if we're all auditioning for these roles, and this role comes in, but it goes. Maybe you're like, oh, I'm perfect fit for this role. I'm going to take run with it, or someone else is going to be a good fit for that role,
Yeah.
so they're going to run with it. I love that idea.
I get a lot of callbacks when I'm not cast.
And you said so. This is one. What was the other you were talking about?
The other one is more thought experiments where I like a concept and I want to, usually it's some sort of synthesis of different ideas, building up certain things. And I don't want to say like 100 ideas at this point, but I have dozens of ideas that fall into this category that are like, oh, this is an interesting thought experiment. This would be an interesting concept. Do I have the energy, wherewithal, drive to make it happen? Is it going to be at the top of my priorities? Almost never is the answer to that. And so they just exist as the sort of concepts floating in my brain. And instead, it's more this stuff that filters in where like space is cleared, right? This thing that I was going to do has to be canceled. And so I suddenly have a month
Mm-hmm.
of free time that I was not expecting. And not that, I have full months of free time, but compared to the month's worth of work that I was going to devote to that particular project. Um, one example um, is the huge snowmageddon that we had in Texas in 2021, where like everyone's power turned off. Right? Like I did not have power in freezing temperatures for 60 hours. So there was like nothing that I could do related to work. I it was not that I couldn't leave my bed, but like to conserve heat, right? Like we only went out as much as we had to in order to take the dog out to pee, and otherwise we just like stayed in bed. And I did the vast majority of the work on my second deck during those 60 hours. It was just like nonstop because there was nothing else that I could do. And so that's what I mean by the like having that kind of an opportunity presents itself
Mm-hmm.
and filters through, and I just take that. So in those instances there's not a ton of intention. What ends up being more intentional is once it's done or once it's started, what am I going to do with it? And then that's when I turn to divination. I try to forecast, I try to predict, I try to understand. I think about, what's the best way to market this in the ways that I feel comfortable doing? What are different options I could be considering other than this? And even in those instances, there's not a lot. I try not to ask too much of the universe, but when I do, I'll put like I regularly have gifts on the altar for ancestors, for the goddess. Just like, okay, I am refreshing this. I would love a little help. I'm not asking for
Mm-hmm.
anything,
Yeah, yeah.
that you're unwilling to give or that has significant strings attached. In part because I feel pretty lucky and privileged in what I have, and so I don't want to like get greedy. I will I will use I will use up that spiritual divine goodwill on the stuff that's, a little bit more retributive where I need some backing where it's like, okay, I've done these good things. I want to time to take people down a peg.
Yeah, there's a most Indian the Vedic rituals literally kind of, pretty much every action that you do is said it's not in my, I'm not doing it 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 in my, I'm not do name. I'm doing it in your name, in the deity's name. And you kind of say,
Right.
and then so it's kind of like made as an offering for them, and then they just almost imbibe it, and then you wait for the fruits of the labor later on. So.
Yeah, and if it's not, I mean, I really like that, so I'm curious to hear more about how, if you have examples or how that works. But for me, I have certain astrological placements that suggest like, oh, if you try to force your hand, you will be slapped down,
Mm,
right? And so be careful sort of what you wish for. Yes, you can force your will, but there is a balance that happens. And so if it's not really in the best interest of, say, the greater good or, the people that you're trying to help, then, and it's really coming from this sort of ego, self-centered place,
mm,
which of course I still do some of those things. Like I am
mm,
I'm not some sort of saint, but that I'm really careful about that to make sure I'm willing to sort of pay the price for that on the back end. And so it means that I'm pretty cautious with what it is that I'm trying to do because I've seen some of the consequences that, that make you realize like, oh, okay, this is not just a sort of psychological thing going on. Like there are actual
mm,
consequences to this. Do am I willing to have I thought through what those are? Am I willing to do that? Am I in a position where I want to make that kind of bargain? Or, you know, is it is it maybe pushing things, or is there sort of too much at stake that could be disrupted? Which is in part why I think witchcraft and magic is particularly valuable to people who feel like they have nothing to lose,
mm,
which
mm,
is certainly marginalized. Some like folks within marginalized groups, not marginalized groups writ large, where it's sort of like, well, I mean,
yeah.
there's not a lot that can get worse for me right now. Therefore, I'm willing to do whatever it takes. And you know, for others of us who are more cautious, I'm a Taurus. So we're typically seen as risk averse. I'm going to be pretty pragmatic about, okay, what do I actually need? What is it that I actually want? What am I really trying to do? Is this the right way of going about doing it? Do I have something else? And I mean, obviously, none of us has the answers to those, but we have to ask and answer those questions for ourselves and our own personal standards and ethics.
Mm. But it was almost like it reminds me of the saying in the Bhagavad Gita where they talk about like the way they talk about karma is it's almost like this is the best that I can do, and then I'm not going to worry about the results of it. You take care of it, almost like it's out with you. You take care of the results. I love that.
And is that specific to, sorry, you were saying that, you'll sometimes, or
Yeah.
not necessarily you, but in the mythologies, it's like giving to or doing something in service of one of the deities. Like if this is right, you take it and run with it. And if it's not, it sort of dies where it is. Is that is that specific to certain deities? Is that specific to certain traditions?
So usually you invoke the fire, and then you invoke the different like deities of the directions and stuff. But then pretty much every offering, when you're saying, I'm giving this as an offering, and you say literally say idam agnaye idam namama. This is for the fire. It's not for me. This is for you. This is not for me. And then you allow the fire to consume whatever action you're doing, and then so similarly, like if all the actions that are going to come forward from this point on is for you and not for me, it's almost like kind of getting rid of the responsibility, kind of like
Yeah,
offloading it onto some other power, right?
yeah. I I mean, I think that is for me, as I said, I'm sort of risk averse, so that is certainly an appealing aspect of saying like, okay, if it's in the best interest, right? Like if this is in line with what is deserved, send it out. And if it's not, let it just sort of melt away. Personally, I appreciate the the responsibility shifting of that. So it's like, okay, but for me it's also a matter of humility of saying like just because this is something that I want
Mm-mm.
doesn't mean that it is the right thing. So not to pretend that, the responsibility shifting isn't deeply attractive, because it is. But like, oh, I don't want this, I don't want the blowback if this was a terrible decision. But it's also thinking through, like, I can't see it all. I can't know it all. I don't have the full picture, and I'm working from my very biased, self-centered perspective. How can I recognize that there's more that I'm not seeing. And so if it's not really for the good in the way that I think it is, then I don't want it to happen, right? Just because it's for what I think is good in the moment. So it's a little bit of both, right? That responsibility shifting, passing the buck, but also saying like I I don't always know what's best, even if, on paper or deep in my heart, my like burning soul, it feels like it's right. I'm willing to believe that I am wrong.
Mm. That's great. I don't think a lot of people take responsibility for their thoughts or their actions that much. So how do you reconcile that with, say, when you do readings for people or when you visualize people and either do, yeah, you kind of give them a reading. How does that fit in?
Um, in terms of the responsibility or the terms of,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, I try to be really clear with what I believe is possible and what I think is coming from the cards, what I'm intuiting that is not from the cards, and what is my own take on a situation, just based on sort of like professional advice in a non expert format, but someone who's seen a lot of stuff in various ways. And
That's
so,
interesting. So you almost split the. You kind of say this is what I think and this is what the cards think.
very rarely will I say what I think unless, like, I disagree with what the cards are saying. And they're getting a card reading,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or an Akashic Records reception, or, you know, some sort of mediumship work or whatever. And so I want to pass that message on because, again, I don't know what I don't know. And know that it's bad advice or that it's not correct for their situation. But if it's something that I personally would not take as advice just in my own self, I will often say, like, me personally, as Thomas, I would tell you to do this. So the cards are saying this. I just want you to be clear that, like, this is not advice that I would take lightly or that makes a lot of sense to me or was sort of my first impression. But I do believe that it is the message that you're supposed to be getting from the cards. And then those instances are pretty rare, but I would talk that through with the person. Very rarely, I shouldn't say very rarely, within those already rare scenarios, there are times when it's a recorded reading that's delivered. And so I have to be really careful to couch sort of my own personal qualifications in that because I don't want them to know that it's just like gospel truth and that there isn't some sort of process, filtering that's happening. But in a live reading, I can have a conversation with someone about, do you know why it would be suggesting this thing to you when that seems like logically not the right path to take, right? And then as far as, what I believe is possible, there are certain types of readings that people are like, oh, don't do, I've done many a pregnancy reading, right? And like there are certain things that are not related to the biology of the person,
Mm,
but are related to something else that may have an impact on the body as, a vessel, right? And is the thing that I suggested actually helpful when they get pregnant? I'm not going to take responsibility for it. I didn't do it, right? It was just a message from the cards, but like helping to make sure that it's very clear what's coming from where and how much weight I'm giving to it. And I said there are some things that are not from me and not from the cards, right? Which are just sort of those like psychic insights or intuitive hits, you know, stray thoughts from the collective unconscious. And those, if they are a reader, I'll explain that I don't see this in the cards.
mm,
This is not how I would normally interpret it, but I keep hearing or I keep thinking this thing. And if it's not related to cards, like an Akashic Records thing, or it's someone who isn't familiar enough with the cards and they'll just get confused, then I don't qualify that because it's all the same sort of cloud of information as far as they're concerned.
This is fascinating to me because on some level you've learned like the different aspects of your brain. Seriously, I really am fascinated because you've literally like kind of. I thought I was going to dissect your brain out, but it seems like you've already done a lot of that processing of saying, this is my intuitive, where I have that, and then this is another place where I'm thinking more about what the cards, like how the interpreting the cards, and then this is the other aspect of me, which is my own like thoughts and processes and biases that are coming in that are like talking about stuff, and then you're kind of engaging all these different aspects into your readings, which is kind of a great level of self-awareness, I think. You don't normally encounter in a lot of people, and also I think it shows that you've kind of been practicing this for a long time, that's allowed you to kind of come to that level of understanding of yourself.
Yeah, and I could be wrong, so feel free to dissect.
That's a level of humility that you get from, one thing we learn when we finish our PhDs is, this is the first step of your learning process, is what they tell us. So it's almost like the humility that comes with a lot of experience and practice is something that's very evident in how you're seeing things. Yeah, thank you. I mean, this was like really great, very informative, and I really enjoyed like talking to you and learning more about you than what I already know. So maybe you can tell people where to find you and what things you are looking forward to for the rest of the year.
Yeah, sure. So I'm always at Hermit's Mirror, all one word, .com. That's my website. I have a blog with a bunch of posts. That's where I'll have my newsletter, new classes that are coming up. I do a semester model where I do a certain number of classes live in the fall and then different classes typically in the spring, as well as some other offerings like office hours and webinars that are shorter, bite-sized stuff. I have some self-paced options as well. But the semester model is my favorite. It's a lot. There are only a certain number of people who show up live to class after class. The rest sort of get the recordings and then sit with them as much as they want. But it's we look at divination broadly. So certain aspects of tarot for sure, because that's pretty much everyone who's coming to me. But then also, what can we learn from Lenormand and Kipper and playing cards? What can we learn from runes? What can we learn from bibliomancy, scrying? Right, all of these other methods. How can we apply it in practical ways? Things about potentially running your own business, stuff like that. So it's sort of a whole gamut centered around divination writ large. And then that's sort of the core thing that runs every year, fall and spring. And then constantly, I am on Patreon, patreon.com/Hermit's Mirror. Again, very easy. Instagram, Blue Sky, also Hermit's Mirror, all one word. And on Patreon, I do a lot of astrological transit reflections, guidance where I'll pull cards for that particular transit. So we're about to end Mercury retrograde as we are recording this. Ceres just went into Taurus. We have a new moon today. So all of those things are relevant to the collective energies. And so I'll talk about what I think they mean, read cards about this particular period or for a longer transit like Neptune and Aries, the first year of that transit, and then ways to practically bring sort of mystical ideas into everyday life so that when you are making a cocktail, you can mix ingredients that are relevant to some sort of thing that you want to manifest or bring into your life as a kind of energy, particularly as a way of being, not necessarily an external thing, but like an internal reshaping or redirecting. Food, tea, all of those things allow for that. But then there's other stuff, right? Like you can do certain physical exercises that are more mercurial, more martial, more Venusian, right? And you can do those on Mars Day, Mercury Day, Venus Day, right? And that's a way of honoring that planet or the god or goddess that's associated with that planet. And it becomes like a simple way of offering a devotion to some sort of divine energy that is, that supports the life that you want and doesn't also like require 4 hours of some sort of ritual that you're never going to do again because it was exhausting and you realize like, oh no, I bought the wrong ingredients or I don't have the right thing or like it was cloudy and I needed to see moonlight, right?
I love
Not that
how
those things aren't
it
valid.
almost brings a certain intentionality in how you're living as well, right? It
Yeah.
kind of grounds you in this. Today I'm going to be doing this. It provides you that the groundedness.
Yeah, and I think those big rituals can be valuable, but it's sort of like, when I was growing up at the church, it's sort of like the people who go to church on Easter, right? It's like,
Mm,
sure, you go to the 2 hour service once a year. Why? Like, what are you doing? What is it supposed to do for you? As opposed to if you can bring that intentionality, that practice into the everyday, make it part of life, it feels like there's less weight on it, right? It doesn't have to change your world. It can just change one little thing, but every day changing one little thing makes so much progress. Again, if you're in a position to be able to do that, as opposed to what I was saying, like you got nothing to lose and then you go really big, great. You need that change really desperately. But if you're sort of maintaining or sustaining, there are a lot of smaller things that you can be doing that are still keep you in the game, so to speak. I think it's easy to fall out of love, take things for granted with mystical practice if it's not part of a religion and a community that reinforces it. And so doing things that are small and life affirming, I think, are really valuable.
thank
And that's
you.
what I do on Patreon. So
That's great.
to go
Yeah,
back to
and
that initial
I
question.
will put all those links on the whatever documentation of this podcast as well. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you, Siddharth. This was fun.
Yeah,
I need to hear more from you next time if we do this again.
yeah. Let's do it again and just like
Yeah.
do a coffee chat about it. It'll be
Yeah,
fun.
yeah, yeah.